Deputy Speaker, I was born in South Africa into a nation that had a vile racist policy. I fought against this policy when at school and in university. I found reprehensible the various apartheid laws, such as those reserving certain jobs for whites, defining race, pass laws and so on. But racism, whether positive or negative in intent, is still racism. This brings me to the issue of Indigenous policy. I will be blunt. In my view, there should be no specific Indigenous policy. There should be no race descriptors. There should be no definition of what it is to be Aboriginal, any more than, say, an Irish Australian should have a definition and a percentage of Irish blood that he or she should have in order to be described as Irish Australian. Self-identification is the key to the puzzle. Indeed, the only reason that this is done is due to the racist laws that we have here in Australia. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, or as alternatively, hell is full of good meanings, but heaven is full of good works. I'm particularly disgusted with the headline in Saturday's Australian, "Push for Aboriginal ID Tests." This takes me back to various racial identity tests that took place in South Africa, and they were absolutely disgraceful. There were people where they would have to attend an office and the authorities would look at their fingernails to determine whether they were blue or pink, because people with some black blood would have more bluish-tinged fingernails. They would have do a pencil test in their hair, because people with black blood would be more likely to have more curly hair, so the pencil was more likely to stick. This sort of disgraceful nonsense ended up with a situation where you could have brother and sister getting different racial designations, and the one who had, let's say, the white designation would then have nothing to do with their siblings for fear of being reclassified. This sort of disgraceful thing has got no place in civilised society. Now, I thought when I migrated to Australia nearly 35 years ago that I'd left all of that behind. The fact that we're attempting to define what is Aboriginal or not, and what percentage blood makes a person Aboriginal, it's racist. And it's due to the nature of our laws, where many issues such as benefits, jobs, etc., that you have this definition on the basis of race. I thought I'd left behind a situation where certain people, based on race, had a privileged status when it came to jobs. In South Africa, it was called job reservation. But here we have a situation where certain jobs are reserved for Aboriginals or Torres Strait Islanders. To add insult, many of these jobs have at the end of the advertisement for the position that it is a position under the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. Really, talk about Orwellian doublespeak. Then we allow our Aboriginal Australians to live in situations and support situations financially we would support with nobody else. Here I talk of the remote communities and allowance of the lack of attendance of Aboriginal children at school. With any other Australians, we would insist that they attend school and insist they move to areas where there's opportunity to find work and for the children to attend school. Racism is racism, whatever the intent. The argument about there's an argument about historical disadvantage, and that's true. Australia was invaded 200 years ago. Now, no Australians, regardless of race, were alive at that time, so none suffered directly as a result of that invasion. What is a stain in Australia is that it took so long, 1967, for Aborigines to get voting rights and other rights as citizens. That is something I think we can justifiably apologise for as a nation. But you do not correct an injustice by instituting another injustice, however worthy the aim. You do not address inequity by imposing other inequities. We will never close the gap while we have racist and discriminatory policy. We will only do it by making sure everyone is in the same tent, not some halfway in, halfway out. We need to have a policy to address issues, not race. Very few policy problems are absolutely unique to Aborigines. And even where they do exist, they're best addressed in terms of the issue, not the race. So we should not be dealing with Aboriginal alcoholism or Aboriginal child abuse or in Aboriginal incarceration or a whole host of other issues. Instead, we should deal with alcoholism, child abuse, incarceration, etc., wherever we find it. I can already hear the but. Here's the question, though. Have all those buts had a real impact? Or would it have been better from the start to have a colourblind policy? An Aborigine with a university degree, working a high-powered job, has far less in common with some of the disadvantaged Indigenous youth not getting an education and with all sorts of social problems than does some disadvantaged non-Aboriginal youth with no job and little education. As I said, we need to deal with the issue, not the race. Insanity. Doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. That was from Albert Einstein. Yet here we're doing precisely that. Martin Luther King dreamed of a time where his 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will judge not by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. Yet today in Australia, we have a situation where I, for instance, have been castigated by some as being a racist for the view that we should be colourblind. Indeed, to quote one such critic, to be colourblind is to be racist. Is that really the way that we want our nation to be? For that is what we are doing with our policy. The word racist in terms of our policy and legislation is extremely confronting, but it makes it no less true. We have a 40-year failed experiment in terms of affirmative action and positive discrimination. South Africa similarly is disastrously pushing on with its black economic empowerment program, positively discriminating. It is a disaster, and the situation in South Africa after so much early promise from 1994 is going backwards. Look at Zimbabwe with their disastrous programs of positive discrimination. They're a basket case, and this previous food bowl is now having problems feeding its own people. Discrimination is still discrimination, whether positive or negative. Indeed, categorising, distinguishing people and hoping to help them on the basis of discrimination means that negative stereotypes become self-actualising. What a terrible burden to put on people. I put it to members of this place that the taxpayers of Australia should not be funding lifestyle choices. Yes, I agree with the former Prime Minister, the member for Warringah, when he refers to Indigenous Australians' choice to live in remote communities as a lifestyle choice. In essence, if the noble savage lifestyle a la Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the same one often eulogised, is true, then there is nothing stopping any of the Indigenous men or women from pursuing such an existence on their own. Just don't expect the taxpayers to subsidise it. My contention is that the ideal of the noble savage may be less sanguine and altogether more Hobbesian. Nasty, brutish and short. Separate to that fact is the intractable predicament of Indigenous positive discrimination programs being anti-competitive and anti-liberal. The whole founding ethos and values of the Liberal Party is that we seek equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. We seek to bring all horses to the same starting position, not slow down our fastest horse. Robert Menzies would be appalled by what is being prosecuted. Let me expand on what is broken with our current system and our current way of doing business with Indigenous Australia. I recall going on a trip to Broome, where we were driven around by the local Chamber of Commerce. We were driven past a region where there were lean-tos and a whole lot of smashed beer bottle, alcohol bottles and so on. and the leader of the delegation said, you know, the Indigenous elders are extremely disgusted with us. And he said, we can't do anything about it because it's native title land. We can only do something about it with caravanning and camping legislation, so after 3 days we can get them to move on, but they just cross to the other side of the road, which is also native title land. Now here was the problem, and here was the question that I asked. If the Indigenous elders are disgusted by this, and it is their land, it's native title land, why aren't they doing something about it? I mean, on one hand, we're saying we shouldn't be paternalistic, but on the other hand, we are trying to be paternalistic by saying we will fix it, we'll get the council to do it, rather than the owners of that land to do something about it. Now, there is almost no employment gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous university graduates. The target to halve the gap by 2018 is not on track. So the question then is, where is the critical comment? Where are those people asking and demanding better for Indigenous Australians? Those policies and prescriptions are not working and need to be scrapped, and the victim mentality must end. The gap exists because too many Indigenous people don't participate in the real economy. It won't close unless policy shifts from welfare centricity to economic strategy. Education and employment are the foundations of economic development. Without them, people cannot innovate or produce. If governments don't believe that we can get Indigenous kids into school and Indigenous adults to work, they should simply abandon closing the gap. Everywhere else is a waste of money because the gap will never close. Between 1990 and 2015, sub-Saharan Africa increased school enrolment from 52% to 80%. We need that same focus here. Indigenous adults need to work in real jobs. Nearly 80% of Indigenous people live in urban and regional areas around the eastern and southwestern coasts, areas with viable populations and real economies. Less than 22% of Indigenous Australians live in remote areas. Economies have been built in remote and isolated places before. Look at Sydney and Melbourne. When Arthur Phillip sailed into Sydney Cove, he didn't say there are no jobs, let's go home. But Sydney didn't become a thriving city because of bureaucrats or not-for-profits or welfare or governments. In Aboriginal affairs, there is a preoccupation with things that don't deliver economic development, like welfare, government programs and services and grants, all centre on government dependency. When they don't work, the typical response is to try more innovative or complicated versions of them, as if government dependency will somehow deliver economic development if you sex it up. Cashless welfare and income management, for example, may tackle social issues but don't get people a job, buy a home or get a loan. For decades, a central plank of Indigenous employment policy was the Community Development Employment Program, which employed Indigenous people on community projects and paid an income equivalent to welfare payments. Many jobs involve people doing things that they normally do without getting paid, like mowing their own lawn. Giving work for the dole a fancy name and calling it employment isn't a real job. None of these things generate economic development. Empowered communities is another initiative with government dependency at its core. Here, empowerment means shifting control of government programs, services and funding to local Indigenous community groups within a complex organisational governance and legal structure. This isn't empowerment. Indigenous people aren't empowered if they depend on government for everything, whether administered centrally or locally. Welfare and government dependency don't generate economic development, no matter how fancy you make them.
I thank the member.